So this is not a topic on evolution as such, but I think the way we perceive risks, the way we want to hear about news, is something evolutionary about our love for accidents, for disasters, for emergency frames, and I think even climate scientists like me are attracted to this emergency frame to say there is a crisis, even though my life shows no crisis. So, what are the impacts of putting everything in emergency frames in the context of climate change, sustainability? What are the consequences and political effects? What does it mean for the choices the leaders make? You know, are they susceptible to misuse it, saying there is an emergency, so I'm going to take control? And this I've discussed also in the context of uh, the 1.5 degree C warming target, 2 degree C warming target, because as soon as you set these targets, you say, oh, we are going to cross it. And in 23, 24, we said, we already crossed it, but what does it mean in your backyard? We don't know that, but we keep on saying we have crossed it, which and then translates to saying that we have only so much more carbon left to emit, so we have only X number of years to save ourselves from extinction and so on and so forth. I'm not a big fan of such language. I've, you know, harped about it before in other podcasts, and some people say that's just polemic from me. But I think this is something we must consider because ordinary people who don't understand climate science, climate change, kids, especially youth, are they're reaching a state of anxiety unnecessarily, and we need to give them a optimistic vision for the future. The world is not going to end anytime soon. So yes, we are facing a serious challenge. Yes, we need to find solutions, but that should be the focus, the solutions and what the young people can do to work on solutions rather than scare them and make them feel like there's nothing they can do about it. So, with my polemic again, emergency frames are mobilized in contemporary sustainability debates, both in response to specific events and strategically. The strategic deployment of emergency frames by proponents of sustainability action aims to stimulate collective action on issues for which it is lacking. But this is contentious due to a range of possible effects. We critically review interdisciplinary social science literature to examine the political effects of emergency frames in sustainability and develop a typology of five key dimensions of variation. This pinpoints practical areas for evaluating the utility of emergency frames and builds a shared vocabulary for analysis and decision making, which is what is most critical. So it's a nice long review paper, lots of excellent references. The text is amazing if you want to learn this, and comes from many disciplines, of course, social science, but also political science, climate change, sustainability, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to reduce it to a relatively brief podcast. It may still end up being longer than 15 minutes, but that's okay. So, just briefly, the notion of emergency has become prominent in contemporary sustainability science and politics. Sustainability issues, especially climate change and biodiversity loss, are increasingly declared as society-wide emergencies by scientists, civil society groups, cities, national governments, and international organizations in an attempt to focus attention and accelerate action. Only 5 years after the first climate emergency declaration in 2016, after the Paris Agreement, almost 2,000 such declarations have been issued. At the same time, acute and unprecedented climate change related impacts, for example, wildfires, droughts, and floods, are occurring with increasing frequency and magnitude, creating sharply felt emergencies in specific locations and anxiety about the futures they portend. An emergency frame is a sense making lens that conveys the meaning that a given set of circumstances constitutes an emergency. However, the consequences of using emergency frames in sustainability governance are complex and so far not well understood. Moreover, the strategic deployment of emergency frames is contentious, while the urgency and irreversibility of unfolding global environmental changes are highlighted as justification, scholars disagree about the implications and merits of emergency frames for advancing collective action. This is what the topic has been in these series of evolution-based papers and how we came to Anthropocene and where we need to go, and also sometimes even strongly caution against emergency frames. Some scholars making sense of this contradictory picture requires a critical synthesis of the diverse possible effects of emergency frames to inform effective and politically astute responses. And remember, politicians, for all the nice jokes we want to make about them, they have to make decisions and win elections. We can give a lot of advice, but we are not responsible. This is something that really we must remember. So I will read a few key points, most salient according to my judgment, but please go back and read the paper. It's an incredibly nice paper. Illustrative empirical cases of emergency frames in sustainability. I won't read all the details, but black summer wildfires in 2019, 2020, it was so much smoke that you ended up with lots of impact. So there was the nature of emergence just in terms of wildfires. Sorry, I have a hiccup. Somebody is remembering. Major wildfires with unprecedented impact and duration. 2019 was the hottest and driest year on records. And key factors: governments, rural fire service, Australian key actors, sorry, Australian Defence Force, public health system, communities, and local businesses. Floods in Kerala, and day zero drought in Chennai, where they said you will run out of water, happened in South Africa as well. This was 2018-19, record floods, climate emergency invoked by some actors, but also debated due to other vulnerabilities, for example, development, regulatory preparedness, and so on. And emergency somewhat normalized due to frequent disasters and losses. So the context matters in the sense outsiders may look at it, look at the images, TV reports, and so on, and say, wow, that looks devastating. But people may have experienced it often, and they may not have the same sense of emergency as outsiders. But of course, climate vulnerability increasingly recognized now rhetorically, but policy changes are not so big or perceived as urgent to address vulnerabilities because a lot of the focus tends to be on mitigation and not so much on adaptation. Governments, again, specific agencies, non-governmental organizations, and so on. And there are other examples, climate emergency declarations. Scientists are involved here at the top. And as I said, we keep on saying climate crisis, but we are living a perfectly normal life. That is a bad sign. Biodiversity loss declarations 2019 to present, again, scientists at the top. And sometimes there are a lot of action items on what people can do, but a lot of times it is about what governments should do, what politicians must do, and so on, without knowing what decision-making process is all about, right? So emergency frames in sustainability, political effects of emergency frames vary across five key dimensions. So you have engagement among mass and publics. So affect, that's a psychological term, emotions, arousal, motivations, behavioral responses, all these are key issues. You don't know what the impacts are on these things, then you are actually playing a dangerous game by putting everything into an emergency frame. Empowerment or disempowerment, ability to accomplish tasks, so agency, level of influence over others, so leadership or behavioral change, patterns of inclusion and exclusion, so emergencies can drive exclusion, let's say, of refugees. If you say there's a water shortage, who will suffer first? Maybe refugees and then poor people. Exercise of formal political authority, rule of law, consent, legitimacy, democratic accountability. So you may have, emergency declaration being used to manipulate the situation and, disallow some people their political participation. Reshaping of discourse, public attention, political imaginaries, and embedded new ideas. So there may be always elites or scholars like scientists who will always say, this is the emergency and this is what we must do. Otherwise, what? We don't always have the answers. Impacts on institutions: strengthen existing institutions, weaken existing institutions, depending on which way. Often it's a limited resource situation. So if you say emergency in one direction and funds are diverted from another situation, which actually may be more vulnerable, then you are creating a weakening of existing institutions, but you may be strengthening other existing institutions. Mechanisms of steering action. These are typically interventions. So people's lives and livelihoods get affected, so we must be careful. So there is examples are gone into more details here. Black summer wildfires in Australia. Nice details. I will leave it in the slide, but I'm not going to read all of it. These have some detailed information on how such cases demonstrate emergency as response and emergency as strategy. So, it's typically when like wildfire is something you can see, lots of animals are dying, it's a horrible scene, and so much smoke and heat that local weather begins to get modified and may exacerbate the fire. So it is an emergency. So then that can be used as a strategy to actually set in motion future policies, actions, and plans for resilience, etc., etc., without always knowing what the unintended consequences could be. Floods in Kerala and day zero drought in Chennai, again, so the dynamics of giving rise to emergency frames were short-lived, and quickly led to normalization. What used to be extreme very soon considered the uh, new normal. In both cases, climate emergency was invoked, particularly by student-led groups, but other narratives gained more traction or discourses emerged out of it. Both emergencies, Kerala and Chennai, highlighted the lack of preparedness of government agencies, even in providing early warning to citizens. Well, early warnings must be provided, but what is the role of the public in using water, not wasting energy, building carelessly on mountain slopes that can convert floods into landslides or convert rain into floods by urbanization, paving, loss of forest, monocropping, etc. So it's not always just government, but there are obviously always attempts. The Indian government is reluctant to adopt climate emergency declaration or net zero emissions targets due to a paucity of technology and finance. So that's the institutional effect, even though net zero declaration has been made for 1970. So this information, some of it may be dated, but doesn't mean that actually there are technologies to head towards net zero. So if net zero is needed by 2070, where do you need to be by 2030 or 2040? Are you getting there? Wow, if the technologies are not there, then you're not getting there. Or if that affects economic growth ambitions, that may get put on the back burner, right? So emergency frames have to be always confronted with political choices, options, ideologies, vested interests, and of course people's engagement. Climate emergency declarations by governments and civil society. Again, a lot of good points here. The declarations may build solidarity at multiple levels of governance and demonstrate the possibilities of collaboration. There may also be indirect effects such as the Fridays for Future movement increasing the ambition of the European Green Deal, although further assessments are needed to establish causal links between advocacy and ambition. So there is always a belief that what I'm saying is going to affect people in a way that they will begin to change their lifestyles, will start acting, and they will make permanent changes, or governments will pay attention and start putting policies into place. But even with that, will there be sustained funding for a Green Deal for the longer term and so on? So just now, an article came out where I was quoted for whether climate scientists should get involved in protests. I'm always kind of split about it because we have so much work to do, and creating such content I would consider is part of that work. But I do this in my free time. I'm doing a lot of research, teaching, advising students, etc., working with postdocs and other collaborators. But I like creating content. I think it's useful, but I'm not trying to change your mind or your behavior. I'm just trying to inform you. So you can learn and then go on, learn more on your own to do what you want to do, right? So practical implications of emergency frame for sustainability governance. Emergency frames do not necessarily overcome the challenges of stimulating ambitious action in the near term, but they may have an important role in longer term political struggles over sustainability issues. So they may have an impact in terms of percolating into UN discussions, creating frameworks for agreement across nations, because sustainability is a global problem, needs global collective action, and we've been saying our evolutionary traits are not very well suited for global collective action. This is where I would like to link emergency frames, how we love stopping and looking at an accident, or how some scientists keep on highlighting the climate disaster, saying, see, I told you so, but they have a limited value in terms of what we can actually do about it, other than maybe just cause more anxiety and lead to a flight or freeze reaction, which is not necessarily good. Whether emergency frames should be part of a sustainability science and policy is an open question, which is to some extent depends on underlying views about the role of the process versus outcome in sustainability governance. So sustainability is a continuous mission. Sustainability has to be sustained. It's not like we reached sustainability and we are done, because we are constantly using energy, water, growing food, and we need to do a lot of things that have to be sustained. Funding also has to be sustained. Political will has to be sustained. Increasing occurrences of emergency as reaction, for example, floods, droughts, and wildfires in coming years may reinforce the legitimacy of the emergency as strategy due to the upheavals. Ethical concerns, for example, equity and justice, must remain at the heart of emergency frames, both to stave off misuses such as power grabs, erosion of rights, and to proactively address concerns of those who may be wary of emergency frames. If you think about the COVID reaction, some countries put zero COVID in place and people were basically put in prison in their own house. Tremendous restrictions. Did that really help deal with COVID better? Evidence says not so. Accounting for the complex effects of emergency frames requires attention to the context. The five dimensions identified in this review are closely tied to specific contexts, for example, social, political, geographical, and historical, suggesting that context has a key mediating role in understanding the effects of emergency frames. So, research is needed on how to go forward on that. This is a longish text. I'm not sure I'll read all of it, so let's read some of it. What are the implications and next steps? It is clear that emergency frames can have diverse effects on sustainability science and politics. It also seems likely that the use of emergency frames will persist, for now at least, given growing disruption of the Earth system and public demand for ambitious action on issues such as climate change and biodiversity. And scientists also like to be, you know, in the forefront saying, yes, yes, this is an emergency. This review provides a foundation for future work to systematically examine the political effects of emergency frames and builds a shared vocabulary for comparative analysis. The question is whether emergency frames enhance or reduce the prospects of mobilizing ambitious action defies a straightforward answer. So this is a good question, but there is no key answer, no silver bullet. A key next step is to look in depth within specific bodies of literature, for example, disciplines covered here, as well as particular fields such as disaster and crisis management and securitization to draw out further conceptual and comparative insights. Emergency frames are both an empirical claim about the world and a political intervention. Okay, you always hand power to somebody when you use an emergency frame, no matter how good your intentions are, how honest your intentions are. As a strategy for generating collective action, this approach is complicated by existing ideas and practices connected to the notion of emergency, even though declarations of emergency by non-state actors may seek a new type of emergency politics that foregrounds ethical concerns. Okay, so there is climate change, we must do something, but we must also be equitable and just. How do we ensure that? Who ensures that? Do we have steps recommended to make sure that happens? That's not always clear, right? Scholars, policymakers, and civil society should not be too quick to embrace nor discard emergency frames, as they may have different implications depending on time frame and context. So we have looked at few case studies of that. Some contexts may be able to absorb the risk of adverse consequences, for example, robust democracies, so mistakes can be corrected, unintended consequences can be overcome, whereas others may be less well placed to do so, for example, those with authoritarian tendencies or strong political polarization. Authoritarian tendency is to not admit that you made a mistake, but to keep saying this was what was needed and I'm a great leader. So there is a balance needed, which is challenging to navigate and will differ across societies and will evolve over time. But within this mix, emergency frames may have a key but probably only partial role to play. Relying entirely on emergency frames to motivate collective sustainability action may risk seizing up the gears of society and politics rather than lubricating them. And of course, as a climate scientist, I'm always worried that we are jumping into the middle of these complicated issues with socio-economic, socio-political consequences, but we are not always aware of those. We are just convinced that we are in charge of saying what a deep crisis this is and what must happen. Greta Thunberg, she is now a force of some sort. What are the impacts of what she says? Is she aware of what the logical steps are and what the logical conclusions are of what she's demanding in terms of, let's say, equity, justice, and global collective action, and so on and so forth. So all this does fit well into the evolutionary context we are talking about. So I will leave it here. As I said, it's a bit long, 22 minutes, but it's okay. It's a very nice topic. I hope you find it interesting as well, and follow up if you're interested in more details.